This video is sponsored by ExpressVPN. I don't think you folks have pressed me harder to watch a horror film more than Candyman, which for the longest time I just ignorantly put off watching because it looked like your typical schlock 90s slasher flick with a supernatural twist on folklore. And yes, it kinda is, but after the bewildering and surprisingly shocking experience of watching it, I can safely say that's a pretty unfair sentiment to the film. For the record, my knowledge of Clive Barker is pretty limited. Bar Hellraiser, I don't really have anything interesting or entirely positive to say about the guy. It's not that his work is bad, it's just not my thing. He's exactly what I think of when it comes to cliched eccentric fantasy horror writer who loves dwelling on the occult while trying to distance himself from a poor man's Lovecraft comparison as much as possible. Very rarely do I ever hear anyone ever truly mention his work. It just seems that he made his name predominantly through licensing his creations to other people to adapt, much like this one. Candyman was developed from Barker's short story The Forbidden from volume 5 of his Books of Blood collection that, while takes the general synopsis of Barker's vision, molds it into a more fulfilling and intriguing narrative. For what is effectively an old-school mythical ghost story, Candyman is a surprisingly subtextual film. Until it's not. It begins by exploring issues regarding the American socio-economic divide, deviance, and identity, before brushing all of that aside to become this grotesque splatter flick that reminds you just how powerful a rumor can be. So let's talk about it. Candyman is more or less just another variation of the boogeyman that's amalgamated from various famous urban legends including Bloody Mary and The Hook, where rumour has it that if you say Candyman 5 times into a mirror, it will summon this dapper looking ghost who will mess you up with his hook for a hand. In Barker's story, it's a bit more nuanced than that, shall we say, downplaying Candyman as more of an obscure human figure without a backstory, and instead of having to say his name 5 times into a mirror, just doubting his existence was enough to summon him like that weird kid from school that you adamantly tried to avoid. Actually, when you think about it, his entire legacy is based on being a petty, attention-seeking son of a bitch who wants people to fear his legend without much effort on his part, but not so much that people are certain he exists. He sits on this thin threshold of wanting to have an overwhelming sense of power over people, and acting more like a psychological presence that makes you question just how real he actually is. The story follows a graduate student called Helen who is researching urban legends with her academic partner until they hear of the local legend of the Candyman, who is said to have murdered several residents of the Cabrini Green housing project. Soon, Helen begins seeing the Candyman for herself, to which she is framed for the murders that he begins committing to keep his sinister legend alive. Now, it's this point that gives the film its very enigmatic feel. Other than Candyman's victims, Helen is the only person to ever actually see him, making it seem like she's possibly possessed by him because, given the circumstances of each murder, it's impossible to ever objectively prove that Helen didn't commit the murders. I think it stops you from ever really getting comfortable or familiar with Candyman. The film manages to feel unpredictable despite being structurally similar to other slasher movies. It's just that the film never reveals why Candyman has taken such a profound interest in Helen. Sure, it is greatly implied that Helen is supposed to be a reincarnation of Candyman's former lover given their remarkably similar appearance, but again, it's never officially confirmed in the story and left purely down to speculation. It's that lack of certainty and obscurity that makes you feel somewhat helpless to Candyman's hypnotic control. Helen, and thus we as the audience, feel toyed with, like we're just a pleasure to Candyman waiting to be consumed at any moment, hence what I guess makes up the symbolism of candy. I know candy has the whole connotation with danger to children when it comes to Halloween, thus playing on the perpetuation of fear-mongering rumours, but the metaphor works quite well in the context of Candyman's evil. Essentially, it's assumed by the residents of the Cabrini Green housing project that Candyman has them all in the palm of his hand. They're his property, his perishables, if you will. He keeps them in his pocket to maintain his fearful legend, and eventually wants Helen to help extend and sustain his fear, which in the end she chooses to destroy at the cost of her own life, so that the residents can be set free from what is practically a psychologically tormenting curse. This metaphor then extends into the social themes of the story. I don't want to get too bogged down in the actual historical context because I want to stay focused on the horror angle, but Barker's original story was inspired by his personal experiences of the British social class system, to which writer-director Bernard Rose upheld by focusing on Chicago's Cabrini Green housing project, where it became notorious for poverty, crime, and gang activity. The way Candyman is presented by the residents is that he's kind of like an inconsequential punishment, one that's not rooted in reason or just, but what it does reflect is how the residents of the housing project are perceived by society. As Helen discovers, not everyone in the project is a malicious, savage criminal. Most of them are simply desperate, struggling people, isolated away from society and deemed as a problem. Candyman just becomes the icing on the cake to their marginalization because he seems to judge and prey upon them because they're weak to his control. At the same time, he represents society's labeling theory, in which an individual or group are labeled with specific preconceived opinions or prejudices that, as they become accustomed to the label, they reinforce it, and thus a self-fulfilling prophecy is born where they become their label. It shows how society treats these residents as all inherently criminal, violent, and socially evil, with Candyman not only exploiting this label to his own power, but also perpetuating it as the project becomes infamous for its serial killings, especially that one child who gets castrated in a public restroom. I don't know how Bernard Rose came up with that one, but regardless, it casts a very dark, ominous shadow over everyone. But before we go any further, if there's one legendary fear that's proven to be real, it's all those sneaky hackers and data collecting parasites that plague the online world. So that's why this video is sponsored by ExpressVPN. If you want to ensure your online safety and security, a virtual private network masks your IP address and encrypts your data so it prevents anyone from tracking you when you're shopping or handling personal information that you don't want seen or stolen. Obviously, my personal usage is so that I can get access to the US Netflix selection because the current one in my country is absolutely terrible. It's as simple as downloading the app for your phone, browser, tablet, or games console, selecting a cheeky wee country of your choosing, click connect, and voila! You're protected while you surf the web. ExpressVPN is less than $7 a month with a 30-day money-back guarantee, so if you decide to check it out and it's not really your thing, don't worry, they'll give you a full refund, so there's no risk whatsoever in giving it a shot. So take back your internet privacy today and find out how you can get 3 months free by clicking the link in the description box below. And while you're at it, let's get back to talking about Candyman. Given Rose's screenplay was inspired by real murders like Ruth McCoy, who was murdered by an intruder who accessed her apartment via an opening behind the bathroom medicine cabinet, for all the fantastical elements of the film, it plays so much better on the social fear of crime and violence than even some of the most realistic films out there. Basing the horror on rumour and legend is so integral to how this fear is manifested and sustained. The media loves to constantly remind everyone that everything is bad, only solidifying the problem by giving it attention, much like how just ignoring the existence of Candyman is technically what makes him weak. If we just stop reinforcing the problem, that's the solution. You take power away from what you fear by simply not giving it the attention it desperately craves, which, let's face it, is very reminiscent of today's oversaturation of opinions and noise. Anyway, we should talk a bit more about this story. Rose's backstory consolidates the themes of Candyman, being that he was the son of a slave who managed to break away and grow into prosperity during the 1800s Civil War. However, racism being what it is, Candyman was a prolific painter who fell in love with a white woman whose father had a lynch mob cut off his hand, replace it with a hook for some reason, smeared him in honey, and he was stung to death by bees, with the mob finally burning his corpse and spreading his ashes over where the housing project is currently located. In the story, Candyman kidnaps a baby to use as ransom to persuade Helen to join him in immortality because, like I said earlier, she's implied to be a reincarnation of Candyman's lover. It furthers that social fear of children's safety and stranger danger. Since we have these residents trying to live through the reign of Candyman, what they don't want is to raise their children under the same reign of terror that oppressed them. In the end, Helen's sacrifice ensures that the children can be released from this unending fear of death, breaking the cycle of misery that Candyman has always tried to preserve. I think it's interesting that Rose compared Candyman to a seductive romantic figure from an Edgar Allan Poe story, and it makes sense. There's something entrancing and powerful about Tony Todd's performance. While he gives off a haunting, menacing vibe, he's also subtle and charming. While his entire purpose is purely evil, and the grisly way he kills people is absolutely harrowing, he still has a way of calmly inviting you into his world and persuading you to stay. Whereas a lot of iconic horror villains are either cold-blooded killers or playful eccentric caricatures, I don't think there's a single other movie villain like him. I mean, he doesn't have an immense amount of screen time, but his presence is certainly tangible, even when he's not on screen. Put it this way, I kinda want to watch the film again just to observe Candyman's energy. Helen always feels like she's being watched because she is, and that everlasting impression of Candyman really compounds just how scared the character are, regardless of how real or imaginary he is. There's no sense of relief to any scene in the film. The film even has an explosive payoff in the conclusion when Helen comes back to haunt her cheating scumbag lover and make him pay the price for abandoning her at the first moment she became tormented by Candyman. When one legend ends, another begins, caused by the very real pain they experienced in life. That's of course why I decided to ignore the sequels. I think the film has a very definitive closure. I like how the conclusion recontextualizes the story as a transition to evil, showing how Helen suffers tragedy and takes it out on the world after being marginalized and rejected as just another problem that society ultimately wants to ignore. So yeah, there you have it. I guess my initial hesitation to watch the film because of all the potential hyperbole kinda plays naturally into the themes of rumour and hearsay that the film delivers on. Candyman is certainly the prime example of a solid cult classic. It never gets too bogged down in trying to be some profound film at the expense of intense chilling scenes of violence that aim to shock and disturb without tastelessly overindulging on it. It's a story about lasting impressions and the legacy left on those around us, especially when that legacy is influenced, shaped and manipulated by others outside our control. It's mildly tragic but never cynical, establishing a true sinister myth that echoes long after the film is over.